So on behalf of the Department of Psychological Sciences, let me welcome all of you. I really appreciate your coming out. I appreciate all the support you've all given the series this year, which was in some ways kind of experimental. We wanted to see how it would work, and I think it's worked pretty well. So I appreciate all of you, and also any feedback you might have would be very welcome, as we are planning to offer this series next year on a different topic, a different theme, but kind of a similar format. So any feedback you have would be welcome at the end of Jamie's talk. Anyway, this afternoon it is my privilege to bring to you one of our own faculty, Dr. Jamie Arndt, as our distinguished speaker. But before I introduce Jamie to you, I'd like to just make a couple of brief comments. Once again, for those of you who've been here every time, I wanted to just acknowledge the other participating departments and units on campus that have contributed to the support of this series. I also wanted to acknowledge the donors that have generously supported this series. And finally, since this is the last talk in our series, I wanted to make sure that I acknowledge the kind of behind-the-scenes work of the people on the committee, Steve Hackley, Wendy Sletsky, and Christy Van Marl. Also, Melody Galen in the Dean's office did all of our nice artwork, which you've seen, the programs and the posters. And finally, Kelly Davis, who's been really a fabulous source of support. I'm trying to see her. I don't know if she left the room. But anyway, she's been great. There you are. Hi, Kelly. Everybody should give Kelly a big hand, big round of applause. Okay. And since this is the last lecture in this year's series, I wanted to just take a minute and tell you a little bit about next year's series. Next year, the topic of our series will be on love, sex, and close relationships. And we have 5 speakers participating next year, so we'll span the academic year next year rather than just only have speakers in the spring. And I don't have titles for people's talks yet, but these are our speakers: Tom Bradbury from the University of California in Los Angeles, Lisa Diamond from Utah, Dave Geary, who will be our, again, our local guest speaker, Bob Levinson from Berkeley, and Phil Shaver from Davis. So we think it'll be really exciting and really fun, and as I said, be sure to give me any suggestions that you might have about a format or whatever that you think might make the series more interesting and exciting next year. Now, just as I said, I want to just say a few things about Jamie. Many of you, most of you probably know Jamie, but you may not know so much about his scholarship, which is a really amazing and outstanding body of work. But Jamie obtained his PhD from the University of Arizona, where he worked with Jeff Greenberg, and he came here right out of graduate school in 1999. He's an amazingly productive scholar who has more than 75 publications to his credit already, many of which are published in the top journal in our field, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. I didn't take the time to count the number, but it's enough to put most of us to shame, I can assure you. His work has been funded by the National Cancer Institute, as well as he's received a number of developmental grants from the University of Missouri. And his work, as you will see shortly, is, I think, characterized by a high degree of sophistication, methodological and theoretical sophistication, and touches on really a set of very profound issues that go to the heart of what it means to be human. I trust you'll find his comments very engaging. With that, let me turn over the program to Jamie.
Thank you. Oh, let me turn on here. Can people hear me okay? All right, awesome. Thank you, Lynn. That was humbling and inspiring. We had some technical difficulties with the slides. We could get them either on the laptop or on the screen, and I thought it was more important for me to be able to see them on the laptop, but Lynn pointed it out that might not work out so well, so you have the benefit, so I apologize if I'm turning my head a few times to see what it is I'm talking about. So it's really exciting to be here and be a part of this series, make the long and arduous trek from McAllister Hall. So that was fun. What I do want to do is just jump right in and tell you a little bit about some of the ideas my colleagues and I have been exploring, which I think are prefaced well by a quote from Thomas Hardy when he writes, "If a way to the better there be, it lies in taking a full look at the worst." And certainly we, as both historically and in contemporary times, have seen our fair share of the worst. Violence and conflict are often so rampant that they seem like part of the fabric of the human condition. And what I'd like to ask is the question of why. Why is it that we seem to have such difficulty getting along with those who are different? And I think that what I'd like to suggest is that part of the reason has to do with a fundamental aspect of being human, with coming to psychological grips with the existential predicament of realizing the transience of life, with managing the awareness of the possibility that our lives are sort of, well, merely random specks on a cosmological calendar, destined to end as nothing more than fertilizer pushing up some daisies. And what I'd like to suggest, and in this talk convey, is that these ideas may have some utility for understanding the all too common human propensity for violence, but then also suggest how this analysis might be used to foster more peaceful forms of coexistence. By way of brief outline, what I'd like to introduce is a perspective called terror management theory, which is the conceptual vehicle that inspired a few of the different research directions I'd like to launch into. Noting at this point that many of the studies I'll be talking about were conducted by my colleagues. I was fortunate to be involved with a few of them. So if in going through there's stuff that you think is, well, pretty inane and unwise, chances are it was the stuff by my colleagues. But if there's stuff that you find somewhat cool or interesting, I'm happy to take all the credit for that, sort of. All right, so terror management theory was first proposed by social psychologists Jeff Greenberg, Tom Baczynski, and Sheldon Solomon about 20 years ago. And it was based primarily on the work of a cultural anthropologist named Ernest Becker. In particular, 3 books that Becker wrote in the 70s, The Birth and Death of Meaning, The Denial of Death, and Escape from Evil. And Becker took a multidisciplinary approach to trying to understand a variety of facets of the human condition. He distilled and tried to synthesize work from a variety of disciplines and theorists, including Darwin, Freud, Marx, Kierkegaard, Plato, Mead, Otto Rank. We could go on for quite a while, pulling together their insights, and he used 2 broad questions to launch his analysis. The first of which, what is the first of which, is how are we as humans the same as other animals? And he noted that like other animals, we have a biological proclivity for self-preservation. Of course, this is not a new observation. William James, Charles Darwin talked quite a bit about this. Heck, even the Bee Gees talk about staying alive, so you know that it's got to be important. But what Becker realized and suggested is that while this is vital, we can consider this alongside a complementary question, noting not only our biological proclivity for self-preservation, but also wonder about how are we as humans different from other animals. And he said, okay, let me think about that attribute that facilitates our survival. And it's obviously not our physical acumen, right? Physically speaking, we're somewhat pathetic, and I'm happy to hold myself up as the prototype in that regard. The point being that, if we had to rely on our physical attributes, we might have been trampled by some woolly mammoth on our way back to the cave. Rather, we survive not on our physical acumen, but on our ability to think. And Becker focused on 3 types of thought: our ability to think in terms of time, to reflect back, to reflect forward, our ability to think symbolically, and also our ability to think self-reflectively. And he noted that these attributes give rise to a tremendous potential for self-consciousness, which is a very cool thing in a lot of ways. As Kierkegaard noted, we can experience very cool stuff. We can experience the Missouri basketball season and advancing to the Elite Eight and be aware of the fact that we're experiencing that cool stuff. So as Kierkegaard suggested, there's a tremendous upside to this, a sense of awe that can come from our capacity to be aware of ourselves. But there's also a rub. Okay, there's a problem, if you will, and I think it's eloquently and efficiently captured by a quote from a very interesting film by John Cassavetes called Shadows, when a character says, well, it's perfectly obvious. Man, in contrast to other animals, is conscious of his own existence, therefore conscious of the possibility of non-existence, ergo, he has anxiety. Okay, you don't see ergo used too much anymore, but I think it's a good word. And one of the things that Becker would like to suggest is that knowing that we're going to die, and not only knowing that we're going to die, but knowing that death can occur at any time for reasons over which we very often have no control, elicits a tremendous potential for anxiety. Well, if that's the case, then it prompts the question, so what do we do? Right? We're obviously not sort of biological blobs of twitching protoplasm shriveled in a corner, and Woody Allen's got a great line of us groping for volumes the size of hockey pucks. Right? We're going about it, at least not most of the time, we're going about our daily affairs. We're managing this anxiety in some capacity. So that suggests the question of how. If you buy that this would create anxiety, then you have to posit a mechanism by which we would manage that anxiety. And Becker suggests, look, this is a problem provoked by our capacity for symbolic thought. So what follows then is that perhaps what we do is we find a symbolic solution. And he suggests, I think somewhat radically, that that is in part the emergent psychological function of culture, which he defines as a shared symbolic conception of reality that imbues the world with meaning, order, and permanence. Now, culture does this in a variety of ways. It does so in part by answering a variety of fundamental questions we might have about what life means and how we should live our lives. For example, cultures provide an explanation of creation. They address the question of, well, how did we get here? Okay, often these can take a religious bent, right? God created the 6 days and took a well-deserved break. We can note that these types of explanations vary widely. There's some wonderful creation myths out there. The Fulani tribe in Mali have a wonderful creation story about the world being created from a drop of milk. And I'm a big fan of milk. So I like that explanation. We also have scientific explanations, right? Darwin's theory, the Big Bang theory, and so forth. So cultures provide some sense of how it is we came to be where we are. Cultures also offer a prescription by which we can understand what we're supposed to do while we're here. Cultures offer a sense of determining what constitutes good behavior, what constitutes bad behavior, what constitutes right and wrong, how we can feel like people of value. Laws and morals would be examples here. Okay, the third thing that cultures often provide us is a sense of what happens to us after we're here. Okay, cultures will offer us some promise of immortality, and this can happen, of course, literally with many religions, but can also happen symbolically. Okay, as we endeavor to contribute to something grander and more meaningful than our own lives, perhaps the nation, the political party. We might, in our career mode, endeavor to publish that great book, write that seminal paper, or perhaps even give that memorable talk. So what Becker is suggesting, in part, is that we live our lives ensconced in a fictional hero system. And he writes, and this is kind of a lengthy quote, I'll preface by saying it's kind of long, but I think it eloquently captures a lot of stuff. It doesn't matter whether the cultural hero system is frankly magical, religious, and primitive, or secular, scientific, and civilized. It is still a mythical hero system in which people serve in order to earn a feeling of primary value, of cosmic specialness. They earn this feeling by carving out a place in nature, by building an edifice that reflects human value, a temple, a cathedral, a totem pole, a skyscraper, a family that spans 3 generations. The hope and belief is that the things man creates in society are of lasting worth and meaning, and that they outlive or outshine death and decay. All right, so that, in a sense, is the foundation of Becker's analysis. And often in talking about these ideas, I get the reaction from people, well, all right, that's kind of funky, kind of cool, maybe it has some weight, but I'm sort of struggling to understand how this helps us to make sense of human social behavior. And I think we can start to make sense of human social behavior when we consider a few implications that tumble out of this analysis. Okay, the first of which is that our sense of self-esteem, okay, our beliefs of being a person of significance in a world of meaning are culturally relative. Okay, what I mean by that, of course, is that what garners prestige and value in one culture does not necessarily do so in another. And in this culture, I think sports are a great example of this, right? We obviously value a person's ability to hit a round ball. Okay, of course it's round. If it's a ball, it's got to be round. But we value a person's ability to hit a ball with a wooden stick to such an extent that we'll pay him $25 million a year and we'll put him on the cover of cereal boxes. Many other cultures, of course, the Fulani in Mali, the Sambia in New Guinea, not so much. We can note that in our subcultural context as well, we subscribe to different systems of values. We here, many of us, traffic in a scholarly world where we value scientific contribution. Doesn't lend itself so well to the cereal box, although I think I want to roll something out and see if it works. You know, maybe there's potential. All right, this then suggests a second implication, and that is if our sense of self-esteem and our beliefs are culturally relative, then that means that there are fragile constructions that need social validation. And this, of course, is an idea that social scientists have explored for decades. We need other people to believe as we do to lend a sense of meaning and purpose to that which we do. In fact, I have to believe that my meaning system is absolutely correct in order for it to provide a viable sense of security and a roadmap for how to live. Okay, so as a result, we construct a variety of rituals, cultural rituals and the like, to reaffirm our system of beliefs, as evidenced here with this Klingon drinking festival. Okay. All right. So this then suggests there's a potential third implication that really starts taking us along in our story, and that is that if our beliefs demand are fragile constructions that demand social validation, what happens when we run into people who believe differently? Okay, the problem that comes up here is that the existence of others with alternative beliefs may threaten the faith in the validity of our own. Okay, so when we encounter people who subscribe to a different view of how the world works, that potentially undermines our faith in our own system of meaning, and we must respond with some form of defense. Okay, we must react to neutralize that threat to our belief system. The theory outlines a variety of ways that people do this. I think the one that is most pertinent to the topic at hand is eloquently, again, foreshadowed by somebody other than myself, Alan Harrington, in his book, The Immortalist, when he writes, "Cruelty can arise from the aesthetic outrage we sometimes feel in the presence of strange individuals who seem to be making out all right. Have they found some secret passage to eternal life? It can't be. If those weird individuals with beards and funny hats are acceptable, then what about my claim to superiority? Can someone like that be my equal in God's eyes? Does he, that one, dare hope to live forever too, and perhaps crowd me out? I don't like it. All I know is if he's right, I'm wrong. So different and funny looking. I think he's trying to fool the gods with his sly ways. Let's show him up. He's not very strong. For a start, see what he'll do when I poke him." So really what we have here in a paragraph is what I've taken far longer to describe, is essentially the essence of the terror management framework, which we can summarize by way of saying that our desire for self-preservation conflicts with our awareness of mortality to create a potential for extreme anxiety or terror that we largely manage by immersing ourselves in a cultural belief system that imbues life with a sense of meaning, a sense of permanence, and provides some measure of hope for death transcendence to the extent that we meet prescribed standards of value, which is what our perspective defines as maintaining a sense of self-worth. This is really the basis of the theory, which has been applied to a variety of research directions, and I've noted a few listed here. What I'd like to focus on, though, is how we can use this analysis to understand the human propensity for violence. And let me pause and just say, I meant to mention this at the get-go and then spaced, but if you do have any questions, feel free to interrupt as we go and just trot them out, and I'm happy to try to clarify things. So in thinking about this, I think one question that can be useful to start with is to consider whether or not our cultural beliefs, our identifications, our sense of self-worth do in fact protect us from the awareness of death. Okay, and one way that I like to think about this is to think about our cultural beliefs, our sense of self-worth as a psychological shield, if you will. Okay, and the stronger that shield is, the better insulated we are from concerns and cognitions pertaining to our mortality. The weaker that shield is, the more exposed we are to such concerns. So we can take this idea and articulate it in the form of a hypothesis, what's referred to as the death-thought accessibility hypothesis, and suggest that if our worldviews and our beliefs do in fact protect us from the potentially paralyzing and terrifying realization that we're fated to obliteration upon our mortality, just to be uplifting for a moment, then, well, if we encounter people or situations that somehow threaten or undermine our belief systems, then what we should see is an increase in the accessibility of death-related cognition. How much people are thinking about death, even if they're not necessarily aware of it. Okay, this is an idea that has been examined in a variety of different ways. I can illustrate with a very simple and somewhat recent study by Jeff Schimmel and colleagues. And what he did very simply, in going through studies, I should note, I'm going to present just sort of some broad brushstrokes of procedural information. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. I probably can't answer, but I'm happy to fumble my way through nonetheless. What Jeff Schimmel did is he brought in Canadian participants, and in the context of a typical social psychology cover story, said, all right, now we're exposing you. They were exposed to information that disparaged Canadian society and values. Or they were exposed to information that was critical and negative and disparaging, but towards the values of a different society. In this case, Australian society and values. And then after exposure to either of those sources of information, this was done in a between subjects design, he measured the accessibility of death-related thought using a standard approach in which participants are presented with word fragments that they can complete with either death-related words or neutral-related words. So for example, you might get COFF blank bank, which if you're in our typically caffeine-deprived state, you would complete as coffee. However, if you have death on the mind, so to speak, you might be more likely to complete it as coffin. Similarly, you might get GRA blank blank, which you could complete as grant, or if you're thinking about death, grave. And the logic is, the inference is, the more word fragments a subject completes, oh, I got a laser pointer here, nice, with death-related words, the more we would infer that death is accessible. And then alternatively, the more they complete the fragments with things like coffee and grant, the more that we would infer they're suited to being an academic. I thought that was funny. Okay, so What did he find when he did this? A very simple two groups design. He found that subjects who were exposed to information that disparaged Canadian values, these are Canadian subjects, showed higher death thought accessibility or more death word completions than subjects who were exposed to critical information but not targeting their own belief system. Illustrating, I think, perhaps that our beliefs about our culture and our society function in part to protect us from ideation about our mortality. Okay, these basic effects have been replicated in a variety of ways, targeting a variety of different beliefs, religious beliefs, just conceptions, beliefs about self-esteem, romantic relationships, our similarity to other creatures, converging to suggest that we use a variety of different elements distilled from broader cultural conceptions to help insulate us from the awareness of mortality. Now, with that in mind, I think one of the things we can do is take a step forward, which is always, I guess, better than taking a step backwards, and we can ask, okay, if this is in part the function of beliefs to protect us from death-related ideation, what then are the consequences of accessible death-related thought for how we interact with and relate to others in our social world? Okay, this is a question that has been probably the most copiously researched question in this particular literature, guided by what's referred to as the mortality salience hypothesis. And this hypothesis suggests that if our worldviews and our self-esteem, again, protect us from the awareness of death, well, then we can flip the death thought accessibility around, looking at it in the reverse, so to speak, and reason that reminders of mortality, what's dubbed the jargony term here as mortality salience, should result in intensified efforts to bolster, defend, and uphold our worldviews and to protect our sense of personal significance. Okay, this is a basic hypothesis that has been examined in a variety of ways. The first study to examine this possibility looked at bond decisions by municipal court judges as they evaluated alleged criminals. The reasoning by Rosenblatt and colleagues in 1989 was that judges should offer a particularly stringent assessment of the situational influences of death-related thought to the extent that judges are trained to be objective administrators of the law. Okay, and if we think about this hypothesis, what we then get to is the reasoning that, okay, if our worldview beliefs function to protect us from concerns about mortality, then if we're reminded of such concerns, we should like much less or be negative towards those who undermine or violate our conception of the way the world is supposed to work. Put in the context of this study, they reasoned that judges reminded of their death would be more punitive towards someone who violated their belief, in this case, an alleged criminal, than judges not reminded of their mortality. And they studied here, they used a prostitute as the example. So the procedure and methodology was, again, rather simple. They got a sample of municipal court judges. They gave them a bunch of personality questionnaires embedded in which, for half of them, were 2 questions asking them to reflect briefly on their own mortality. For the other half, they did not receive these questions. And then they were presented with typical arrest information, warrants, and the like for an alleged prostitute, and asked to set a bond amount. Essentially, how much is the get-out-of-jail card going to cost? Okay, and the question here is, even though the prostitute obviously on the surface has no connection to concerns about mortality, would reminding judges of their mortality lead them to be more punitive towards the prostitute in terms of the amount of bond they set? Okay, and when they looked at the data, what they found is that in the absence of being reminded of death, judges tended to, judges tended to set bond amounts in the amount of about $50. However, after they were reminded of their mortality, this figure jumped up to $450. All right, suggesting, according to these authors, that what we're seeing here is when confronted with the awareness of death, judges wanted to defend their beliefs, which included upholding legal statute, and thus became more punitive towards someone who was purported to violate that belief. Okay, this study conducted almost, 20 years ago now, was the first in what has become, literally hundreds of studies documenting something that's dubbed the worldview defense effect. The idea that awareness of death motivates people to cling tenaciously to their culturally derived beliefs, reflecting and manifesting in a variety of different ways, including becoming more positive towards those who uphold our beliefs, becoming more negative towards those who threaten our beliefs. Now, a few brief comments about the nature of these effects. Mortality salience, this manipulated technique, has been done in a variety of different ways, contrasted with a variety of different control topics, replicated in, at this point, over, I think, 15 different countries. And then this final point is one that I'm very excited about and I think is a key one, but I'm going to gloss over. What research suggests is that these effects occur primarily in response to our non-conscious awareness of mortality, not necessarily our conscious awareness of death. And I'm happy to talk about any of these points at much greater length, but what we'd like to do, if okay, is to proceed along to the next chapter here and say, okay, with this in mind, how can we then begin to understand reactions to violence that exist in the world? And I'd like to start illustrating by considering ways in which people may tolerate certain forms of violence, and specifically considering the domains of hate crimes. Okay, hate crimes, of course, are an offense wherein the victim is targeted because of his or her membership in a particular group. Most often, this is a racial group. We're looking here at hate crime data from 2006. Most often, this is a racial group, but it can also be based on religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and even, though far less often, disability. Now, I think one of the things that's very interesting about hate crimes from the present perspective is that while we're often aghast at such crimes, if you think about the logic of the analysis I've been presenting for a second, an interesting situation emerges when you think about that for some observers or some passerbys, standard-bys, the victim of the crime represents a worldview threat to that individual, right? If I am a Christian, a victim against a Jewish individual is, a crime against a Jewish individual is a crime against somebody who threatens my own particular belief system. As such, the logic of the analysis suggests that when we're faced with managing deeply rooted existential fears, people may be more tolerant of crimes against those who threaten their own beliefs, in a sense, vicariously lashing out at those who believe in a different conception of the world. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty clear with your example about religion, because religion clearly would threaten someone's idea of their mortality.
Mm-hmm.
But how does it relate to race or something else like that? How would that make you more aware of your own death?
Yeah, I think the race thing is an interesting one. I think racial distinctions can, but not necessarily, threaten our own cultural identifications, as it were. And what I mean by that is this notion that just confronting somebody of a different race doesn't necessarily undermine our own beliefs, particularly if that person is viewed within our own particular cultural lens. However, if that person starts to step outside of the way in which our society, our stereotypes, as it were, instructs us to view such individuals, then it can be threatening. So I think a racial distinction is a bit more complicated and nuanced than perhaps a distinction based on religion or a distinction based on sexual orientation, okay, which can go to the fabric of how we conceive of morality, which is why you'll notice that we avoided the racial issue in this next study, because I think it is a bit more nuanced than that.
Yeah, but even with your example with the judges how would that relate to the judge's sense of mortality? Like if it were a religious issue, I would understand it.
Well, the idea is that part of the judge's belief system is believing that the law is important and that people should follow the law. That helps to structure the way they see the world. That helps to give a sense of order to their conception of the way reality should work. All right, so when you come across somebody who violates the law, well, that's now threatening that judge's conception of the way life is supposed to be, the importance of this particular belief, as it were. And so they want to react more punitively towards that person as a way of defending and reaffirming the value of their own beliefs. Does that help to clarify? Okay. Yeah, the racial thing is an interesting one, one that I'm more than happy to get back to and we will return to in some capacity a little bit later on. What we were interested in is bypassing that sticky thorn at this particular time. And I was fortunate to work with a colleague of mine, Joel Lieberman, to try to study this idea that people might, as a way of vicariously lashing out at those who threaten their beliefs, become more tolerant of hate crime perpetrators. So what we did is we grabbed a sample of Christian heterosexual participants and we gave them a summary, a vignette as it were, of a particular case involving an assault, manipulating whether or not the assault was ascribed to an anti-gay, anti-Semitic, or ambiguous intent. So for example, subjects were given information in which they read about a crime, about a fellow leaving a Chicago rally. What varied between subjects was whether the rally was for Jewish pride, gay pride, or it was left unclear, and that on the way home the individual was attacked and the assailants were overheard shouting anti-Semitic, anti-gay, or just aggressive insults, and that the police later apprehended a suspect fitting the description of the assailants. Then, like the Rosenblatt study I described a second ago, they were reminded of their mortality or an aversive control topic and asked to set a bond amount for the alleged perpetrator. Okay, and so what we're wondering here is how are the bonds that people allocated going to vary as a function of these different conditions? And when you look at the data, when we looked at the data, we see in the absence of being reminded of mortality, typical of the hate crime literature, you see that people were more punitive, allocating higher bond amounts towards perpetrators of the hate crime than when the crime was ambiguous. However, when reminded of mortality, we see a different picture unfold. Specifically, when the crime was ambiguous, like the Rosenblatt study, people became more punitive. Would that hold when it was a hate crime? The answer is no. What we see is a depressed level of bond allocations, people becoming, in a sense, what we inferred as more tolerant towards the hate crime perpetrator by allocating lower bond amounts. Suggesting, in a sense, that perhaps what's happening is that as people strive to uphold their cultural beliefs as a way of managing deeply rooted fears about mortality, they will become more tolerant of those who commit violent acts against others threatening our own beliefs. All right. This, of course, gives rise to the question, okay, maybe we'll tolerate violence, but will we ourselves commit such violence? Okay, this was a study, or this was an idea that we were very interested in a few years ago. And we were trying to think about how would we study whether or not awareness of mortality would increase our own propensity to act aggressively towards those who threaten our beliefs. And we were wondering about this, not really satisfied with many of the laboratory paradigms that exist for studying aggression, thinking, what are we going to do? When we came across and were inspired by a series of newspaper articles documenting the use of hot sauce as a means of showing aggression. I was fortunate to be in Tucson at the time, enabling the opportunity to conduct extensive and very essential field research where we went around and sampled a variety of types of hot sauce to figure out, could we use this as a way to measure aggression? And we came up with a paradigm which we dubbed the hot sauce paradigm as a way to study this. And the idea here, I think, is relatively straightforward, although it does become procedurally somewhat complex in the context of an experimental study. But what we did is we brought people into the lab. We reminded some of them, using now a standard paradigm, of their mortality or not. And then we gave them an essay that either supported or threatened their political views, which we knew by virtue of an earlier assessment during some screening survey. So, for example, liberals were given an essay that said, liberals are the cause of so many problems in this country. They try to help everyone. Their bleeding heart stance is a joke and incredibly stupid. Conservative participants were essentially given the same essay that flipped it around, only now labeled them as the butt of stupidity. And following reading these essays, we said, all right, the study's done now, and now you're going to go to a second study. And this second study looks at taste preferences and the allocation of food likes or food dislikes and so forth. It was a rather elaborate cover story, but essentially they were told that now what we want you to do is allocate a taste sample to the author of the essay that you just read. And we're doing this so that the experimenter can remain blind to who's doing what, so forth and so on. They were further informed that here's a taste preference inventory this other person completed, and lo and behold, the person does not like spicy food. So the question was, how much hot sauce would they allocate? They were given a Dixie cup, not unlike this, and said, okay, you can give as much or as little hot sauce, knowing the person doesn't like spicy food and has to consume the entire quantity of hot sauce. Okay, and what we found when we looked at the data is that in the control conditions, subjects allocated approximately 14 grams of hot sauce for the subject to consume, which we determined by weighing the quantities after they were administered. However, when subjects were reminded of their mortality and were allocating hot sauce to someone who threatened their beliefs, that figure jumped up to 26 grams. Okay. Looked at graphically, what we see is that the juxtaposition of reminders of mortality and confronting somebody who threatens, in this case your political views, led to significantly higher amounts of hot sauce for that individual to have to consume. Suggesting the inference was, in these particular studies, that what's happening is people are faced with the need to shore up faith in their particular meaning system. When they encounter a threat to that meaning system, they respond aggressively as a way of trying to diffuse that particular threat. So, at this point, what we've started to see is perhaps that aggression exists in part as a way for us to defend and maintain faith in conceptions that help us to deal with our existential reality. Another question we can ask, of course, is to what extent does this analysis enable us to understand politically oriented conflicts and intergroup issues out in the global world? This was an issue that we thought about at great length, and we were reminded of a part of Ernest Becker's work where he suggests that, you know, the most blood has been spilled not by those with evil motives or those criminally unbalanced individuals that Dr. Rain talked about so artfully last month, but the most blood has been spilled by those trying to be part of something grander than themselves, following the great leader, the country, the nation, in the service of heroically triumphing over those that the leader designates as evil. And if you look back globally, that's where the blood gets shed, or at least the most quantities thereof. So we thought about this and we're like, wow, that's pretty intense. And it was in light of that ideas that we tried to make sense of a rather curious real-world phenomena that happened about 8 years ago. And that was Bush's approval ratings on September 10th were hovering around a depressing 50% mark. However, on September 13th, that catapulted up to an unprecedented approval rating of 90%. Okay, it's obvious what tragic event intervened at that time, and I think it's interesting to consider from the present perspective the psychological significance of that event. an event which featured on the TV, in the newspapers, on the radio, catastrophic reminders of carnage, of our vulnerability, and of the fragility of life. In addition to that, what literally we see is the attack and collapse of vital American symbols of financial and military power. So it seemed to us that part of what this tragic event did is it served as a massive mortality salience induction, if you will, as well as being a core threat to the American worldview. And so the question that we began to consider is, in this context, to the extent that the leader becomes the embodiment of the cultural belief system, would reminders of 9/11, would reminders of our mortality motivate increased identification with then President George Bush as a charismatic leader leading us in a heroic triumph over evil? Not just a heroic triumph, right, but a religiously inspired triumph. So that's what we set out to do in a series of studies. They were very simple studies. Again, we reminded some subjects of their mortality, some subjects of 9/11. This particular study, as many of the ones I've talked about, used student samples. So as an aversive control topic, they were asked to think about an important upcoming exam. And then very simply, we measured support for George W. What we found is that subjects reminded of their mortality or of the events of 9/11, what we labeled as the terrorism condition, showed higher support, stronger endorsement for President Bush than subjects reminded of a different aversive topic. We conducted a number of studies along this line. In one variant, we compared voting preferences for George W. towards then Democratic nominee John Kerry. And what we found is that in the control conditions, you see a strong preference for Kerry. However, after subjects were reminded of their mortality, that completely flips, and you see Bush emerging as the preferred candidate. All right, so some of the things that these studies suggest, I think it doesn't exactly bode well for our electoral choices, so to speak, being the product of a rational, informed understanding of the candidates, but it does speak to a potential irrational aspect of voting preferences, as it were, utilizing the leader as a way to identify with the belief system and thus transcend the anxieties of our existential predicament. It further opens the door, perhaps, to considering other incantations of intergroup conflict. And one such example, I think, was nicely explored by Tom Pazinski and colleagues when he studied martyrdom. And what Tom Pazinski thought about and reasoned is that, okay, if reminders of mortality motivate people to act aggressively against those who threaten their beliefs, then would such reminders motivate people to engage in martyrdom attacks, violence against others, potentially even at the expense of their own lives? So Pazinski and colleagues were fortunate to get a sample of Iranian students. They also did the study in the US, lest you think it's unique, and reminded some of them of their mortality or an aversive topic, and then confronted them, presented them with purported interviews of other Iranian students. These interviews were about the United States as a subject. Half of the subjects received an interview which was basically pro-martyrdom. Okay? Yes, the United States represents the world power, which Allah wants us to destroy. And it went on a little bit in that spirit. The other half of the subjects were given an essay that was anti-martyrdom, explaining that no, this is not an acceptable way to go. And what they measured, very simply, is how much the subjects liked the student and also how much the subject indicated they would be willing to join the cause that the target espoused. Okay, and what Pazinski and colleagues found is that in the absence of being reminded of mortality, Iranians were generally more favorable towards the anti-martyrdom student. However, as you might now expect, and I thought very compellingly when I first heard about this, when they were reminded of mortality, we see an increased favorability in the pro-martyrdom student and also an increased likelihood of saying, I'd be willing to join that cause. Okay, the basic spirit of these effects have been replicated in a few different ways in the last couple of years. One interesting example of this was led by Gilad Hirschberger from Israel, and he tried to understand psychological factors that might contribute, that might escalate resistance to the Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip and northern Western Bank. This was conducted in the summer of 2005, right before that historic event was going to unfold. And by way of brief summary, what Hirschberger and colleagues found is that Israeli students in one study, or settlers of Gush Katif in another, when reminded of their own mortality and initially opposed to the withdrawal, they showed an increased willingness to engage in violent resistance to the disengagement plan. Now, in many of these studies, it is indeed the case, you might be wondering, that subjects were presented with a questionnaire asking them to think about death. And of course, as we navigate through life, we're not often, unless we're, intro psych students, confronted with questionnaires. And so, to what extent can we get beyond this? I think it's reasonable to note that as we go through life, we encounter a variety of stimuli and situations. Of course, perhaps particularly in war-torn areas, of things that will increase the accessibility of death-related thought. One such thing, of course, in a war-torn area concerns pictures, or rather buildings being bombed, explosions, and the like. And Kenneth Vail, a student here, has initiated a series of studies that I think provocatively explores this, finding that at least among a sample of U.S. students being exposed to what we call rubble, not only conjures up cognition about the Reaper, as it were, increased death thought accessibility, but also increases support for aggressive military action. And the idea here is that we're confronted with stimuli frequently that can conjure up concerns about mortality, and this can escalate our aggressive support, rather our support for aggressive action against those we perceive as threats to our culture and our society. So at this point, I think there's at least an interesting possibility that we can look at part of the reason for the proliferation of violence as rotating around people's efforts to secure a meaningful view of the world and a significant view of themselves. This, of course, prompts the million-dollar question. And if you buy this so far, and if you think there's a shred of merit to these ideas, that then the question that follows that needs to be asked, researched, and then hopefully pursued is violence an inevitable reaction to fear? Fortunately, there's been a number of research directions providing some insight into how people might manage this terror in ways that foster a more peaceful form of coexistence. And I'd like to just review briefly a few of these possibilities. One approach is I look at, going back to my shield metaphor, I'm on this huge metaphor kick and I can't get out of it, but going back to my shield metaphor is we can think about strengthening the shield. And recall in the original articulation of terror management theory that I suggested, what seems like eons ago, that our sense of self-significance provides a vital buffer against our concerns about mortality, such that we would expect that boosting self-esteem, or looking at people who have high self-esteem, should reveal less destructive, less aggressive, less prejudiced responses to reminders of death. And indeed, a number of studies fit that analysis. Another variant of this approach is to look at the role of attachment security. Okay, a number of authors, Otto Rank, and of course most prominently John Bowlby, articulated way long ago that our interpersonal connectedness with secure relational attachment provides a vital security blanket for us as we go about our affairs. And there's just, of course, a huge literature on the effects of attachment security. Mario Michelunser, a prominent researcher in Israel, has done a lot of work integrating attachment and terror management ideas. And we've done a few things as well, suggesting that both dispositional and situational instantiations of increasing attachment security can mitigate some of these effects. In one series of studies, we did the mortality salience approach. We presented participants then with a prime in which they were led to think about secure interpersonal relationships, or subjects were led to think about positive relationships, but ones that lacked that security that their other close relationships provided. And we then measured their support for aggressive military approaches to international terrorism, finding that in the absence of the secure prime, we see that mortality salience, reminders of death, increased endorsement of the use of extreme force. But when people had that interpersonal security activated, there was no such effect, and in fact, a significant attenuation. Another approach towards addressing this mitigation, I think, deals with refunneling the trajectories that a response can take to feature more tolerant and compassionate beliefs. And the logic here is I think, very straightforward, at least from this perspective, and that is, to the extent that our awareness of death compels us to live up to important values, and to the extent that tolerance becomes an important value, then what we might see is that reminding people of their mortality leads them to be more tolerant. Okay, and this idea was initially explored back in the early 90s and found to have some merit. In recent years, research has started to look at the importance of tying the compassionate value into the elements of the particular belief system to which the individual subscribes. And this is key in a sense, I think, because the ammunition, probably not a great word in this context, the ammunition is there. Many of our cultural beliefs contain prescriptions for compassion and tolerance, but they often get lost in the shuffle of dogmatism and the like. Some researchers, Zachary Rothschild and colleagues, set out to examine this idea, and what they did in a couple of studies, they used US students, and a third study, they used Shiite Muslims in Iran. And after reminding them of their mortality, they presented them with different types of value primes. In one variant, they're presented with compassionate religious scripture. Do goodness to others because Allah loves those who do good. Or they're presented in other conditions with compassionate secular adages. The same thing, but you remove the Allah. Do goodness to others because people love those who do good. Then they assessed a variety of different types of responses across the studies. In study 3, it was anti-Western attitudes. And what they found, I think, is quite interesting, is that among fundamentalist Shiite Muslims, when they're presented with a non-religiously labeled value of compassion, it doesn't do jack, right? Being reminded of your mortality still leads to that sort of typical boost in in this case, Western attitudes. But when the value of compassion is tethered to the belief system to which you subscribe, religiously labeled, we see an attenuation of that effect, suggesting that while our cultural beliefs do in fact contain prescriptions for compassion and tolerance, the connection to what's important to us needs to be accentuated in order for them to be effective. Another approach that research has recently taken that I'm very excited about, with all due apologies and respect to Sister Sledge, is to capitalize on the notion that we are family. All my brothers and sisters and me, Sister Sledge, the song, no, okay, scratch that one. Right, so the idea here is to accentuate our common humanity and our shared sense of humanity. This idea comes really from the common in-group identity model proposed by Gardner and Davidio, and it involves people reconceptualizing group boundaries to recognize that which we share with people the world over. Okay, a brief illustrative study of this idea essentially brought people in, reminded them of their mortality or not, and then exposed them to pictures of different types of families. They were exposed to either non-American families intended to prime our sense of common humanity, pictures of an American family, or just pictures of people milling about. And then they measured, in this particular study I'm highlighting here, anti-Arab prejudice. And what they found is that in the neutral and American family values condition, reminders of mortality increased anti-Arab prejudice. But if people were led to think about, in a way, their common humanity, how other people, hey, they're similar to us, dealing with the same junk that we're dealing with, you didn't see that effect. Okay, and one final way I think that you can get at this common humanity idea is sort of an ironic one, but we can highlight the fact that in many ways and in certain domains, we all reside in the same sinking ship. Okay, and they did this by capitalizing and looking for the sunny side of global warming. Okay, the idea here is that if we can accentuate the idea that we all face a common catastrophe, if we're all in the same boat, that can lead to a reconceptualization of group boundaries and break down those kind of barriers. So in a study we actually recently conducted here, we grabbed some students here and reminded them of their mortality or not. We then asked them to read about a common catastrophe, specifically global warming, and how it affects people the world over, or a foreign catastrophe, flooding in China. And then in this study measured support for peacemaking in geopolitical conflicts. And what we found is that in the uncommon or foreign catastrophe conditions, mortality salience, reminders of death, decreased support for peacemaking. But when we thought about the same sinking ship and the sunny side of global warming, mortality salience increased support for peacemaking, suggesting an encouraging potential of mitigating adverse and deleterious effects on those who are different, especially to the extent that we're in a world of increasing globalization and such. So, I think there's a few different ways in which these kind of harmful effects can be attenuated, hopefully suggesting some measure for optimism. And by way of starting to close, and yes, I am going to start to close anytime now, I'd like to turn to another extended quote, which more eloquently than I possibly could, I think really captures a lot of what this research is trying to do. And this is again from Ernest Becker. Actually, I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say, so what are we left with? What are we left with? I'll just tease you with that quote. We're left with, I think, a few different ideas. The idea that our awareness of the transience of our existence gives rise to a fundamental motive for transcendence as we endeavor to identify with meaningful cultural beliefs and acquire a sense of our own personal significance, that we exist as significant contributors to a meaningful cultural drama. We can note that unfortunately this motive for transcendence often manifests with identifications that can entail a certain measure of aggressive and violent reactions to those who threaten our belief systems. But in the face of this, we also see the potential solutions lying in the face of developing secure forms of psychological security, as well as cultural beliefs that reflect tolerance, compassion, and perhaps a shared sense of humanity. And now to the Ernest Becker quote, which I think captures much of what we're trying to do. He writes, "It seems to me that this leaves a margin for reason in the affairs of men. If men kill out of animal fears, then conceivably fears can always be examined and calmed. It is one thing to say that man is not human because he is a vicious animal, and another to say that it is because he is a frightened creature who tries to secure a victory over his limitations. Cultural developments might influence the fear of death and forms of heroism and so blunt the terrible destructiveness that they have caused," suggesting that perhaps part of what we need is a more open and honest self-appraisal of our fears of mortality. And for inspiration on how we might start along this path, we can consider the thoughts of Woody Allen when he suggests, "It's not that I'm afraid to die, I just don't want to be there when it happens." Thank you. That's it. Yes.
Going back to what you started on the anti-Arab prejudice, I noticed that for people who did not have death shown to them, that the instance of prejudice was much higher, even though they were showed pictures of common humanity than in the neutral, or when they're shown neutral pictures or pictures of an American family. Is there any reason for that?
Yeah, so the question was, going back to this particular study on anti-Arab prejudice, that in the absence of being reminded of death in the control condition, we see in the common humanity condition higher anti-Arab prejudice as a result of being confronted with the common humanity primes. And you're asking what's up with that. And I was thinking, boy, I really thought I was going through these slides quick enough that somebody wouldn't pick up on that. I think it's a curious condition, as it were, in the sense that it does not easily lend itself to an explanation. I might suggest that perhaps people, in being confronted with this sense of common humanity, were reacting to that negatively in sort of a reactance fashion, trying to deny that. No, they're different from us. Why that would be so poignant in this condition, but so absent when they were reminded of mortality, I think is a curious situation. But it does suggest that in the absence of thinking about death, you don't want to be thinking about your common humanity, which I don't think is the punchline that the researchers want to deliver. But I think that's an astute observation. Yeah.
I have a question about, I guess it deals with how much of this do you think has to be unconscious and how much conscious? Because I'm trying to think of being a psychopathologist, thinking when terror management breaks down, and I think a great example of that would be panic disorder, where people had this subjective sense that they're going to die, and then it kind of kicks in the physiology, and then it just kind of feeds into itself. Yet these individuals aren't known for violence or aggression.
Yeah.
So how would you make sense of that?
Well, I think you're barking up what I think is just a fascinating tree. So the question was, how do we understand some of this stuff being, I'm repeating it just because I was told to repeat it. How do we make sense of the conscious versus non-conscious concerns about mortality? When we think about certain clinical disorders, we maybe see a flood of conscious concerns, but yet we don't see these sort of corresponding effects. And I think one of the things that a lot of research has been focused on is trying to understand the distinct effects of conscious versus non-conscious concerns about mortality. And what the research seems to indicate is that we utilize sort of a two-tiered defense repertoire, as it were, that when we're confronted with conscious fears about death, our defensive responses shift to getting those cognitions out of our focal awareness. Obviously, thinking about death is not the most pleasant thing to do. That's why I'm such an uplifting guy. But we try to get it out of our head. And we do so through an assortment of rationally oriented strategies. We suppress it, we deny it. If we're playing in a health ballpark, we're going to exercise harder because better health means less likely to die prematurely. Then when these concerns recede out of focal awareness, we see an elevation in these symbolically oriented defenses that I think we were touching on here. Now, so what happens in turning this around, and this is something that some work is just starting to touch on, I'm not doing, which is why it's really interesting work, but this notion of how do we understand people who are exposed to tremendous trauma? All right? How do we understand people who are exposed to very potent calamities that essentially break down their cultural defenses and lead to a swell in these existential concerns? And what I think research is beginning to show is that you don't see these types of symbolically oriented defenses because people are now paralyzed with the more pressing issue of, I'm going to die, or the associated concerns that gives rise to. Often what happens too is I think they can become localized or focalized on a particular more controllable source of anxiety. So we've done some work with not clinically diagnosed OCD types, but at least people who score high on OCD type measures. And so in one series of studies, for example, we remind people of their mortality or not, and then measured their hand washing behavior. And we find that among people who score high on measures of OCD and hand washing, they wash their hands more vigorously, use more soap, more paper towels, and the like, suggesting that the particular mechanisms that they use to manage these concerns have been transferred into presumably a more manageable framework, because the alternative is overwhelming. Yes?
Do I gather correctly from this that it shows how vulnerable we can be to manipulation, especially maybe media?
I think so. I think that's a depressing, or maybe to the extent that we realize it, empowering conclusion that one can draw. You know, cynical people among us would suggest, oh, I'm sorry, the question was, does this show how we can be vulnerable to such media effects, reminders of these sorts of things? And a more cynical among us might suggest that certain presidential candidates were quite aware of the powerful role that fear and insecurity had in, you know, voting preferences and the like. And certainly that's not a novel observation. Editorials, opinion pieces, and the like, talk show hosts expounded at great length about the strategic use of fear in the Republican campaigns in 2004 as a way to try to get people on board with a, you know, we're the best, blank the rest kind of mentality, us versus them, good versus evil ideology. So I think it does convey that we can be vulnerable towards these influences, and I think a lot of people have maintained that political strategists are keenly aware of that and have used these sorts of, not necessarily these specific ideas, but the notion that fear does breed insecurity, insecurity does bring clinging to something that's clear-cut, simple, easy to get our head around. Yes?
As far as acts of violence that are driven by economic or practical reasons or driven by greed, how does the terror management system play with that?
Well, I think, you know, with any, so the question being in terms of acts of violence that are driven by economic or greed factors, how does that fit with the terror management analysis? I think it fits fine in the sense that any act of violence or any social behavior, complex as we are, is certainly going to be caused by multiple things, right? So I don't think any terror management theorist would say that concerns about mortality are the only thing driving our social behavior, or that when we're violent or aggressive or engage in conflict, it's only about providing psychological security in this sense. And certainly economic factors are a potent force in a number of criminal actions, and economic concerns have been also lodged as a potent factor in many geopolitical interventions, as it were. So I think you can have multiple factors influencing an outcome, each operating on a different level. Yeah, Wendy.
Has there been mortality salience research with anybody other than, you mentioned some patient samples, like other than college students, because I was thinking that this must change as you get older, how salient death is to you. And I was thinking among very young people, like preteens, I don't even know if they understand death or think they are going to die. When does that kick in? When does it get worse?
Yeah, no, there's been a lot of stuff that has looked at those. Certainly, the vast majority of studies have looked at student samples. And, you know, at this point, though, there's been, I don't know, we're trying to think about whether it's worth it to count, you know, maybe 400, 500 studies along this line of research. So while the vast majority have used student samples, there's still a wide number of studies that have used non-student samples. These samples have ranged to some very, I think, interesting ones. Australian Aboriginals, for example, is one group that has been used. Samples in Asia, Turkey, a variety of countries. The age factor is a particularly interesting one. We've done some health stuff with women at risk for breast cancer and the like, but when you get to the developmental spectrum, research is starting to look at that more systematically. The earliest age group that's been targeted, I believe, is 6 and 7 or 7 or 8-year-olds, and some work by Mario Michelunster. And what he found is that people weren't more punitive towards things that threatened their beliefs, kids that is, but they were more positive towards things that supported their beliefs. So you didn't necessarily see the, the negativity, but the positivity. And I think, if I'm recalling correctly, a lot of, or the domain that they studied were people's reactions towards their mother. Yeah, so people were much more positive towards things that praised their mother, because presumably mom is the big security blanket still at that age. You got a few more years left before that shifts. Now, going up the developmental spectrum, there's work that's been done through the ages, so to speak. I mentioned the first study was with municipal court judges. Recent research is starting to now look at the more enlightened end of the lifespan, so to speak, the more mature end of things, finding some very, very interesting things, that they are indeed more aware of and cognizant of issues of mortality. And we, of course, all have this unfortunate experience. People at that age, it seems like I can't talk to my mom without her telling me about somebody else who has this, that, or problem, or she's got to go to this wake or that thing. It becomes a much more salient issue. So how are they responding to that? I think the jury is still out. In some ways, it does suggest that they're still defensive, but in different ways. So I think there's more work that needs to be done on that to understand how this repeated exposure starts to play out with people's reactions. And I think that's coming, but it's taken a little while to get there. Yeah.
I was wondering if you included any mood measures or how aversive the control conditions were.
Yeah. Have we included any mood measures, and how aversive are the control things? When this research first started out, that was one of the first issues that was raised, was, well, you're putting people in negative moods, and negative moods leads to this negativity. So over the years, there's been, I think, a rather comprehensive effort to address that. In the vast majority of studies that have been done, mood measures are included. It's generally not found, these sort of subtle reminders of death are not found to increase negative mood. Mood is not found, if you covary it out and so forth and so on, to relate to these things. Oftentimes, the aversive control topics generate more explicit ratings of negative mood. We've done some work looking at physiological indices of anxiety and affect, and interestingly, we did some stuff a few years ago finding that even non-conscious presentations of, like, the word death will increase physiological signs, affective signs of negative affect, specifically increased activity in the corrugator muscle region, but that activity doesn't seem to relate to these kind of responses. I think rather what's happening is, in part, is that these reminders elevate the potential for negative affect, for anxiety. Not necessarily the experience of it, and this I think is a subtle, but I kind of think interesting point, but the potential for it. So there's some work published out there that shows that if you give people a pill, a placebo, under sort of variant of a classic misattribution of arousal paradigm, you give people a placebo and say that this blocks your experience of anxiety, you attenuate these types of effects, suggesting that it's not necessarily the experience of anxiety, but preconscious concerns about the potential for anxiety that might be involved.